Welcome to the Cinematologist Podcast. I'm Dario Linares, and down the line, of course, is Neil Fox. Neil, great to see you.
You too. Hello, hello. Not taping on a Friday, taping on a Monday. So hopefully this week will go better because of this taping.
Yeah, that's interesting. We're setting up the week rather than kind of grinding towards the end of the week and sort of being thankful for a conversation. But yeah, actually just been away, see my parents. Haven't really been watching a lot of films apart from the films that we're going to talk about today. So I've got a lot of focus on that to come. Neil, is there anything else you want to quickly mention before we get into the main meat of the episode?
I saw Black Bag, the Soderbergh, last week.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Yeah,
which I mentioned to you about. Yeah, which I loved because I'm in the bag, pun intended, for Soderbergh. And I'll probably mention that again for our Patreon subscribers in the newsletter that I am.
Yeah. Well, we might talk a little bit about that when we meet up to talk about crime movies. We might mention that as part of that episode, which is one to come, trailing for the future.
Yes, we are taping in person around the theme of crime movies. And I think it will definitely get a mention because I think it's part of a spate of interesting, original crime movies of late. And that was just great fun. And that provided a break from watching the films for this episode, which have definitely dominated my viewing in the last week, which has been really, kind of amazing immersion in a filmmaker that up until being invited to do this episode, I had never heard of, I don't think. Or I had heard of him, but not specifically. I'd heard of the film The Hourglass Sanatorium, which is a bit of a hint, but only through the poster. I remember the poster.
Yeah.
And I knew of it through that. But apart from that, I had no engagement with this filmmaker at all.
No, me neither. And I'm writing a piece of my own for the Substack to go alongside this recording, and it kind of kicks off with that sense of, what kind of a cinephile are you if you haven't heard of somebody? But it's interesting, I think, how this filmmaker is kind of acknowledged that he's underknown, let's say, underdistributed, and a lot of that is to do with the political context of his filmmaking, of his work, and also the kind of choice in terms of whether he stayed in his home country or left. I mean, we're being a bit cryptic here. Why don't you just talk about the episode as a whole and the filmmaker we're focusing on, because it's not classified information, obviously.
No, and it's in the title of the episode. I'm sure it will be when I put it up. So it's like, why we treat it like a game show? Well, yes. The listeners have to guess.
Odd.
So odd. We are talking about the Polish filmmaker Wojciech Has. Wojciech Has, I think, actually. And his work. And it's interesting, so it's not so much a blind spot as we've been kept in the dark as cinephiles, and that's something that the talk covers, is that this is his body of work has kind of not been available, not in its entirety or anywhere near its entirety, and not in any kind of really accessible form for so long. So there is a season at the BFI and the ICA as part of the Kinoteka Polish Film Festival, which kind of celebrates his work. And they did a similar program in the States last year. And it's kind of all of his feature films plus all of his short film work. And like you were saying, he stayed in Poland, so operated under a very specific context when a lot of sort of better known in terms of like how film history's played out, filmmakers sort of left and sort of worked in other sort of national contexts. So this is a really interesting season, and it was the reason that sort of we wanted to do it. And I sort of picked up on the email from the publicist was, I didn't know of this filmmaker, and the chance to spend time with just a significant body of work that was kind of completely unknown, pretty much. And I had, once I started researching, realized I had heard of the Saragossa manuscript, which is the big famous one that he made, and the Hourglass Sanatorium. But apart from that, I hadn't seen them, and I didn't know anything about them. So I kind of took the opportunity to talk to Michael Brooke, who was the programmer of this season and is an expert / authority on Polish cinema, which we talk about a little bit at the start of this this conversation. As a way in, I hadn't seen anything when I spoke to him. I think I saw a short film in the morning of our taping, just for a little bit of context. But otherwise, I wanted to use the conversation with him as a way in, and then sort of focus my viewing on that, because there's no way I was able to see all of the films. So you used him as a guide, really, to a sort of a broad range of the work, which has been so much fun.
Yeah, and it's interesting the timing of this. So if you're listening to this quite close to the release, in the days after, there's still the opportunity to see most of Haas's work, because his section of the Kinoteka starts on the 1st of April. With the Saragossa manuscript, which I'm going to. So if anybody goes down to that, you might see me there. So before that, the Kinoteka was much more the kind of broader range of filmmakers and different types of works that are both contemporary but also older works. But then after April the 1st, Haas kind of takes over the program, as it were. And we've been really lucky to be sent the HD files, the screeners for everything. And
Yeah.
I was kind of just looking down, and I was like, oh my God, there's just loads of this stuff here. And it's real. And the first one I watched was The Noose, which is his feature debut, which I was it just blew my mind how good it was. Really brilliant. And interestingly, then the second one that I've kind of got 3/4 of the way through now is The Hourglass Sanatorium, which is very Buñuel, and you talk about that relationship to surrealism and existentialism, and maybe we can talk a little bit about the sort of, you call it in dialogue in the interview, and I think, I mean, it's always a kind of balance, isn't it, or a difficult thing to kind of, there's a chance we're projecting kind of connections where maybe there are none in a kind of definite sense, like the filmmaker wasn't influenced or didn't influence somebody else, but it's always interesting to see those connections that you see as a viewer, whether they're aesthetic or thematic, or you kind of get the sense that somebody is working under a certain set of conditions, whether they're political or social. And I think it's really interesting, sort of going down a little bit of a rabbit hole with regards to Haas. That sense of him being a kind of, I mean, the critic Tadeusz Miska called it a kind of strategy of solidarity. This idea of not leaving Poland, but creating a kind of artistic zone of independence, trying to remain free of official ideology, and the relationship between his processes of adaptation, which we can talk about after the interview, are interesting. And I think, that sort of positioning him in the relationship to filmmakers who stayed, like Wajda and Kieslowski, but then there was the other filmmakers who obviously left, like Skomilowski and Zulawski and Borowczyk and Polanski, obviously, probably most famously. And that sort of sense of, this is why we don't really know about this filmmaker, because with the Hourglass Sanatorium, that had to be kind of smuggled out of Poland because it wasn't allowed to leave. So there's sort of echoes again of filmmakers like Jafar Panahi in a contemporary setting, and the Iranian filmmakers. But it's a really interesting conversation, and what I really loved about it as well was it sets you up for a deep dive. So I kind of wrote down all of the references that Michael makes, and I'm kind of stitching them together in my own mind to give myself like a primer of Has as a sort of way into Polish film. And I think that's often a really interesting way to do it, where you take one filmmaker and then you spin out to all the others, but that one filmmaker is the through line. So I'm trying to write something alongside today's episode that will go up on my Substack. So it's a really interesting conversation, and again, just to finish off, an interesting conversation about the concept of expertise. How does one become an expert in a particular idiosyncratic field, whatever that might be? Is an interesting story at the beginning that Michael sort of discusses about his sort of connection to Polish film.
Yeah, again, reminds of just some of the kind of the idiosyncratic ways that these things happen. and I think it's a very idiosyncratic body of work in terms of Has's output. Like you say, the kind of the Polish context is fascinating. So I'm glad you found out that. Was certainly how I wanted to approach it for myself, as well as us and listeners. Is like hearing from someone who spent a lot of time in this space, and sort of seeing what kind of ignites through that. So really, I'm glad you had that experience, and hopefully the listeners will too. So let's get to that now. This is my interview with Michael Brooke.
Może bierzemy coś. Idziemy już?
So thank you for joining me today, Michael. Hello.
Hello.
It's really exciting to talk to you ahead of this Wojciech Has retrospective. But I wondered if you could just sort of start with some background on yourself and how you sort of came to sort of Polish cinema, because I know that it's kind of a special interest of yours.
It's one of these things that you sort of fall into by accident. I grew up. I went to school in Hammersmith, and at exactly the point when there were all the big sort of solidarity demonstrations followed by martial law, so I grew up surrounded by Polish fly posting. The local tube stations would show not so much Polish posters of films, but they would get people like Andrzej Klimowski to design posters for, say, Andrzej Wajda's Rough Treatment. I was too young to see them, but the posters were amazing. And I think, what on earth can these films be like? And then it's just, I went to see, I think the first film I saw by a major Polish director by any Polish director, was Jerzy Skolimowski's Moonlighting when it came out, because it was a West London film. I thought I liked the story behind it. I thought I might have a go at recognizing locations, which I did. And it was also a really, really good film, which helped enormously. And that didn't make me think, I should go and watch lots of Polish films, because there really weren't that many around at the time. But then about a year later, I was doing French. I was doing history A level and French. And the French Revolution was one of my subjects. The film Danton opened. I pretty much had to go and see it. I was expecting it to be a nice, polite, sort of buttoned down French costume drama. It was not. It was sensational. And I didn't know at the time that Andrzej Wajda and the Polish part of the team had literally just lived through a failed revolution, and therefore they weren't remotely minded to treat the subject lightly.
Yeah.
But yes, that made quite an impression. And then, like a lot of teenagers, I was into a lot of Eastern European writers like Kafka. I discovered Janusz Szwankmajer's films at about that time. Krzysztof Kieślowski came around in the turn of the 90s, and I was completely hooked on his films. It wasn't specifically Polish then. It was a more general Eastern European thing.
Yeah.
With music as well, there was Janacek and Bartok and Ligeti and people like that. And then fast forward to mid-2000s, Poland has joined the EU. I'm writing regularly for Sight and Sound, and I've become their sort of in-house Eastern European specialist. Someone starts doing a initiative whereby they start distributing a new Polish film every month, and these are not art house films. These are absolutely mainstream films aimed at Polish audiences. And Sight and Sound, being a journal of record, initially wanted to try and cover them all. And I was working at the BFI at the time, and I had a Polish intern, Kamila Kutz, who's now an avant-garde filmmaker of some note. And we originally did a deal whereby we would alternate reviews. I would correct her English, and she would correct my embarrassing cultural misunderstandings. And that's how it would work. And it didn't quite work out like that, because we used to get the review copies so late that we had to turn them around really, really quickly. And, Camilla, if English is not your first language, this is not really feasible. and she was nowhere near as experienced a reviewer. So I ended up doing virtually everything. And then the Polish Cultural Institute, who are extremely proactive, they must have noticed that the same name was being attached to all these reviews, and they thought, well, this guy's obviously an expert. And that's when all the invitations came along to, sort of sit on film festival juries and, sort of go to various Polish film-based events. And so I had about 3 or 4 years of frantically trying to catch up with a reputation that I didn't deserve then. I'd seen Kieślowski, I was very well up on. Polanski, Skolimowski, I knew them pretty well, but Wajda, I hadn't seen that much of at the time. Fortunately, Polish DVDs tended to have English subtitles and also tended to be extremely cheap. So I would just buy them by the truckload and watch them. And I think I finally caught up with my reputation by about 2010, 2011, something like that. And I then fessed up to my lovely friend Marlene Łukasz, the Polish Cultural Institute. He thought it was hilarious. So ever since I've been a specialist in Polish cinema, which is a very interesting place to be.
So what was your first introduction to Has's work? And I'm interested in the first time you saw it in a cinema as well, for reasons that might become clear as we kind of talk, because I think that's a very specific thing that we're interested in on the podcast, is that kind of engagement in a cinema space.
Well, for the most part, I haven't seen Has's films in a cinema. I've seen a couple. There was a retrospective at the Era New Horizons Festival in Wrocław, I think in about 2010, where I saw. I was on one of the juries, and I had to, I had a fixed viewing list, so I was only able to catch a few things. But I think Gold Dreams was the first one I saw on the big screen, which is not the obvious one to pick. I'm still to date, I'm greatly looking forward to it, but I've not seen the Saragossa manuscript on the big screen. I've now seen them all in high definition, which is a big advance. Previously, a lot of them I had to see on imported French DVDs with French subtitles.
Yeah.
So yes, it's weird actually. Has is one of the very few directors I can't give you that.
Yeah, interesting.
Recall of that experience, because they have been so hard to see on the. Actually, no, I tell a lie. I have seen the Hourglass Sanatorium on the big screen at the Barbican, which is amazing. Yeah, that film really needs the big screen.
So did you come into his work in this period of kind of genning up, or?
Yes. It was. I was long aware of his reputation. The Saragossa manuscript is one of these absolutely legendary titles. Those that film buffs have at least heard of, if nothing else. I remember being struck by the fact that in Louis Buñuel's memoirs, he said that he saw it 3 times, and that was extremely unusual for him. In fact, I later found out that he was actually instrumental in getting it distribution in Mexico, because he was such a big fan of the film. But it was like I can't really remember when I first saw it. It was certainly the first decade of the 2000s, and it was off a Less Than Wonderful DVD. It may not even have been my first. Logically it should have been my first, but I think The Noose may have been my first, because that had just come out on DVD in Poland. And The Noose is an absolutely extraordinary film, which really should be much, much better known.
Yeah, and we'll probably come back to that in a bit when we talk about the season in a bit more detail. It was really interesting sort of reading about how he sort of talked about his films and conceived his films, and what he thought cinema was. So just it feels really sort of apt at the moment that these films are getting the chance to be seen on the big screen kind of consistently.
Yes,
in a way that hasn't
and in their totality. We did and a bit about the short films, because the short films are overwhelmingly industrial documentaries made during the socialist realist era. So you get this sort of, there's some great images, but you get this sort of stentorian propagandist voiceover. And but we thought, well, that they're available with English subtitles. Nobody is ever going to do a program with them in any other circumstances other than a retrospective. So why not? So they are. Some of them, the one about the folk music ensemble is a genuinely lovely little film. And some of the pre-socialist realist shorts are also very interesting. It's being able to be absolutely completist in a way that is quite hard when you're putting together film seasons, because there's always going to be one title that gets away for whatever reason.
I just love this idea. I think you said, like, in the dream that is a film, one often has a kind of singular loop, which just feels really, it kind of feels and something that Dario and I talk a lot about, this kind of approach to cinema as a very, very specific form, and as a kind of something where form is front and center. And I know he mentioned that he was interested in form and not content, particularly in sort of response to sort of, sort of the Stalinist period. It just feels really kind of significant now, given, I don't know, sort of trends away from form being even considered, and content and meaning and sort of ideology being much more kind of front and center. So where do you sort of see his films sitting in a kind of broader cinematic tradition? First in Poland, and then
in Poland, it's very interesting. He's been sort of rather apart from many of the other Polish filmmakers, because the ones with the really fantastically Baroque surrealist sensibilities, people like Walerian Borowczyk, people like Andrzej Żuławski, Roman Polanski, people like that, they tended to get out of Poland at a fairly early stage, and for the most part stay out of Poland, because they just did not find working conditions in Poland, ideological conditions in Poland, in any way congenial to the kind of films that they wanted to make. Has didn't leave Poland. All of his films are Polish. I think only the very last one is a French co-production, and that's more about the state of the Polish film industry of the late 80s than anything else. But every single one of the films is Polish, is in Polish, is culturally Polish. He tends to work with the same actors a lot. Gustav Holubek in particular, I think he's in about 9 out of 14 features. He overwhelmingly adapts existing Polish texts. I think there's a question mark over one of his films as to whether it was an adaptation or whether the novella came later. But in virtually all other respects, they are literary adaptations. It's a bit like Stanley Kubrick in that respect. He was obviously very drawn to existing works, which he then substantially reworks into very much his own image. I mean, you will recognize a Has film very, very quickly. It's very, very regardless of setting, he's got to. I mean, they're not all quite as fantastical as the Saragossa manuscript or How to Be Loved, but there is this same, even something like Gold Dreams. There's this scene with this sort of abandoned loft space, which is just full of sort of dilapidated bric-a-brac, and it looks like the sort of set of a Quay Brothers film. It's he just couldn't resist that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And there's also very much another very common Has trope is the history of objects, the history of things, what happens to people's memories, and how they don't necessarily match with the reality, and so on, and how those are the various ways in which they're expressed both verbally and through objects.
Yeah, that's picked up quite a lot in sort of people sort of talking about his work. And I watched Harmonia this morning, the accordion short.
Oh yes,
which is a lovely short.
Which I think is his first solo film. I haven't definitively established whether it's his first film full stop, because there's another short the same year which was co-directed, but it's certainly his first solo credit.
But even in then, it's very much about the kind of symbolic power of the object and what it carries, which I'm really interested in terms of my own teaching. So I teach screenwriting, and I love that idea of the object carrying the story, the context, the subtext, and it's just really beautiful. And it seems to be something that he was really drawn to in a way that a lot of surrealists are in terms of object.
Yes, I mean, I know that whether he can actually be called a surrealist is an open question. I'm not sure he ever saw himself as a surrealist, but Buñuel absolutely recognized a very strong kindred spirit, and I'm pretty sure Saragossa Manuscript is the only Has film that Buñuel ever saw. I'm not sure how he would have got to see any of the others. But you absolutely see where it came from. In fact, I'd be interested to know if the discrete charm of the bourgeoisie, that whole sort of dreams within dreams within dreams structure, whether he was inspired by Saragossa Manuscript. He may well have been. It's known to be a favorite film of his. So yes, there is this sort of fetishization of objects, which is characteristic of the surrealists, and so he is very much. I mean, there's also expressionist elements in his film, but I never really see him as a kind of sort of ideologue when it comes to the aesthetic approach. It's very much how he saw the world.
And what might be sort of, what do you think are some of the reasons why his work didn't travel in the same way? Obviously, because Saragossa is a kind of very monolithic title, in that kind of sort of Eastern European art house 60s kind of.
Yeah, it's the one that broke through. It was. I mean, I looked into the distribution history, the commercial distribution history in Britain, and just 4 films were actually given proper commercial releases, and not necessarily even in sequence. There was How to Be Loved, his 6th feature, which was the one that where people really first noticed him internationally. Saragossa, of course, in a very heavily truncated version. There's running about 2 hours, which must be almost incomprehensible. I've never been able to see that version, though the US cut, which is also heavily truncated, it's lost about half an hour. That's on YouTube. I've often been to try and reconstruct it from using the sort of one of the Blu-rays just to see how it is, because it's doing exercises like that really do teach you a great deal about how films are put together.
Yeah.
So it might well be worth doing possibly in the next few days. Anyway, then after that, it was The Doll, which is his big sort of widescreen costume drama that opened probably about a couple of years after it was made. And then The Hourglass Sanatorium belatedly came out on DVD and then Blu-ray, and has very much become the second Haas film in terms of recognition. And I don't think it was ever opened over here at the time. It doesn't really chime with like 1970s British cinema preoccupations. I hear that one of the reasons why there is such a huge gulf in terms of knowledge of The Noose, his debut, which in Poland was regarded as a major masterpiece pretty much from day one. I mean, I would argue, and I think the evidence backs me up, that it's actually the strongest Polish feature debut between World War II and Polanski's Knife in the Water a few years later. Because if you think of the other Polish debuts, like Vida's A Generation or Andrzej Munch's Man on the Tracks and so on, they were all not through no fault of their own, they were all hamstrung and strung by the need to cleave to Stalinist socialist realism. So in A Generation, you get the obligatory lecture on Marxism and the good guy as the communist, and Vida's clearly more interested in the sort of really troubled, ideologically conflicted guy who, of course, has to die before the end. And so he quite cleverly got around it, but there are, it's compromised in a way that The Noose is not compromised because it was made just after that period. But I gather that it wasn't approved for export because it's about an alcoholic. And Polish cinema was only just starting to be noticed on the international circuit. I mean, Vida's Kanal was the one that, because it won the special jury prize at Cannes, and people say, well, there was something really interesting is happening in Poland. And so other Polish films were approved for export, Ashes and Diamonds being an obvious one. Comedies like Eva Wants to Sleep, it was Night Train, quite a wide range, but The Noose wasn't. And the theory is that it's because it's about an alcoholic, and they thought a Polish film about an alcoholic is just playing to stereotypes and we don't really want to. And I think the writer Marek Krasko was also fairly controversial at the time, and they just didn't want to. They just didn't want it to be a standard bearer for Polish cinema internationally, it missed its moment, which is a great pity because it is an absolutely extraordinary film. You said you've seen it?
No, I just started. I'm gonna watch some after this ahead of sort of taping with Dario before the episode goes out next week. And it was interesting. I wanted to sort of talk to you before in terms of like sort of a guide through.
Well, that one 100%. That is a major film, and it is one of the great films about alcoholics. And Gustav Holubek I think she was making, if not his screen debut, certainly his first screen leading role, is absolutely magnetic. And it's hardly a spoiler to say that he falls off a wagon spectacularly halfway through, because that is what happens in films about alcoholics.
Yeah, it's not regularly just meetings and people getting
no. He starts off, his lovely girlfriend has arranged an appointment to the drying out clinic at 6 p.m. and then she's got to go off and do something, her job or something, and so he's left in his flat surrounded by weird twisted sculptures, and can he get through the day without a drink? And of course, obviously we know the answer. But it's one of these performances, he's so magnetic that you completely understand where he's coming from, even though, you just go, don't, just step back, don't do this. We know, we've seen other films like that. We know exactly how this is going to play out. And of course, it plays out in this film as well, because that's the tragic inevitability of addiction.
Yeah. It's interesting to, like, in terms of thinking about that as this, obviously, but why sort of culturally, Poland wouldn't necessarily want it exported, but also it sort of taps into very much existential concerns in terms of that period, sort of reading about, those sort of themes that come up a lot. He feels very much in line with, a lot of the other filmmakers working across Europe, in particularly the early 60s, in terms of these big sort of post-war existential questions.
Oh, absolutely. It is very much a sort of existential crisis film. yes, he he sort of wanders, or once he leaves his flat, he sort of wanders from sort of cafe to bar and meets lots of people and has various conversations, which inevitably reveal various aspects of the things that he's struggling with, and the things that they're struggling with as well. Yeah.
It's interesting. Yeah, it was sort of read about how fully formed the Noose is and how it's a kind of such a strong debut, and that does feel bound up in sort of just how he talked about cinema. You know, again from like the interviews that sort of floating around online when in quotes, like he seemed to really love cinema as a form for doing this work, even though, like you say, he acknowledged and sort of was drawn to literary and kind of time-based literary works as well, to kind of but really kind of grasped film as a form.
Yeah. Oh yes. I mean, he'd had a extended apprenticeship making these industrial documentaries. I mean, there's 10 years between his first short and his first feature. So by the time he'd made his first feature, on a technical level, he was absolutely superb. I mean, the Noose does not look like a debut feature, because yes, he had already thoroughly, he knew what he wanted to say, he knew how he wanted to say it, and he had the technical chops with which to express it, and also this was made at a very exciting time culturally for Poland, because the October 1956 Gomułka Thaw, which formally abolished socialist realism, led to this creative explosion right across the board and across multiple art forms. I mean, music, for example, you get jazz with Krzysztof Komeda, you get avant-garde experimental music with Krzysztof Penderecki, theatre, you get Jerzy Grotowski, cinema, of course, you get Andrzej Wajda, Jerzy Kawalerowicz, Valerian Borowczyk, Jan Lenica, people like that. Animation, which I effectively just mentioned. It was just literature. I mean, it was just Marek Krasko, who wrote the story about on which the Noose was based. I mean, it was just, you have all this sort of pent up creativity that was suddenly allowed to be expressed, and the Noose was sort of caught up in the middle of that. And so you have all these people who they want to make something really exciting and groundbreaking, and you can tell that they're really relishing in the opportunity, having
And that again feels really timely for me and for us on the podcast, in terms of, bringing this stuff to light in a kind of considerable way, given just the dearth of that approach to cinema. Not necessarily entirely, obviously, I think that cinema as a form in a lot of places is still vibrant and sort of seeking to push forward, but certainly in terms of what passes for sort of Western mainstream cinema, there just seems to be a complete dearth of interest in form and doing that work. So it's really exciting to have this this season and this kind of focus, but also it's tinged with a little bit of sadness in terms of that it's a body of work from the past rather than something which has those kind of resonances.
And it's a body of work that's been largely unseen as well, which is the other. You watch these films, and there are major masterpieces that aren't called the Saragossa for manuscripts and the Hourglass Senator. I mean, How to Be Loved, I think, is a magnificent film. It's one. In fact, when its star, Barbara Kraft-Ullner, died quite recently at the age of 90 something, and the obituaries. I mean, she had an incredibly long and prolific career, but the obituaries almost invariably focused on that part, and said it is the strongest female lead character in the entire history of Polish cinema. Which, this is by people who are more qualified to make a statement like that than I am. But I'm not about to disagree. It is an absolutely extraordinary characterization in a really exceptional film. It's that was the film that's he made pretty much one film a year from the Noose till that, and that was the film that actually made a bit of an international festival splash, and people realized that there was this Polish guy who was actually doing something really interesting.
And it seemed like female characters were of a real interest to him as well.
Yes, he's always been very strong on female characters. His second film, I mean, notably notionally, the protagonist is the bloke played by Tadeusz Janksza, who's in fact he's the same actor who played the doomed Yoshio in Vidas a Generation. He played a lot of doomed characters in the 50s. In fact, in Canal, he's the guy who's dying very slowly of his wounds while in the sewers in Warsaw. And it's actually a real tragedy that he was doomed in real life, because his bipolar diagnosis pretty much killed off his career when it was at its height. But anyway, he is notionally the lead because he's the name actor, so he's the star, and totally understand that. But it is the woman. He plays this upper class young man who decides to reject his background. And he goes off to this bar and he picks up this working class girl and he thinks, right, this is going to make, this is going to give it a whole new perspective on life. And she turns out inevitably to be incredibly intelligent and articulate. Like she can see right through him. Right from the start, and we know that we can. and yeah, so there is a fairly but she could also see that there are great advantages to having a relationship with someone like that. And it also takes place in two different time periods. They first meet immediately before World War II, and then they meet again, then they're separated or the relationship fizzles out, and then they meet again accidentally towards the end of World War II in a very, very different Poland, where the aristocracy is still trying to cling on to their old traditions. It completely changed the environment. Total exercise in futility. And she's married to, in fact, Gustav Hollerbeck from the news. And yes, and then things get very emotionally and historically nationally complicated, and it's another really great film. That's his second feature, Farewells.
Cool. You mentioned Buñuel, and there's an interesting story about Jerry Garcia, picking up that being and where I know that some, I think that the season gets its title, but I just wondered, like, who are the sort of filmmakers and films that you see him in dialogue with? Because just having an overview, not influenced by, but that kind of mining sort of similar kinds of territory. Because reading a lot about his approach and some of the films and the literary sort of starting point, it drew to mind someone like Raul Ruiz in Chile, and I just wondered,
yes. I mean, I don't know if there's any kind of sort of dialogue. I mean, yes, you're absolutely right. The sort of fellow travelers. I think
Sarah Diebler's is a nice one.
The Saragossa manuscript anticipates Peter Greenaway in quite a few aspects. And he was also a direct influence on a younger generation of Polish filmmakers, because he actually taught Małgosia Szumowska, who's one of the leading Polish filmmakers now. She's given a fascinating interview about what it was like working with Has, because he clearly really liked her. While at the same time he would just set her these really bizarre creative exercises that she couldn't even begin to fathom at first.
That's cool, yeah, because I wanted to talk about his work in film education, because I think it's because obviously I work in a university, I teach film and filmmaking, and I've always been interested in that space where filmmakers work within education, sort of teaching the craft. I'm a big fan of Alexander McKendrick's.
Exactly. He's there's another person I'm a big fan of is a fellow Pole, is Wojciech Marczewski, who had the most. I mean, at the turn of the 80s, if you were asked to name the most promising up-and-coming Polish directors, obviously Krzysztof Kieślowski will be one, Agnieszka Holland will be another, but Wojciech Marczewski would unquestionably be a third. He got off to an amazing start with films like Nightmares and Shivers, and then he resolved because the early 80s with martial law, a lot of Polish filmmakers had a hideous dilemma about what to do. Some ended up working in exile, like Andrzej Wajda and Agnieszka Holland. Some ended up trying to make films within Poland, like Krzysztof Kieślowski. Marczewski said, I am not working for the Jaruzelski government under any circumstances, and he basically killed off his career. And he came to England, he taught directing at the National Film and Television School, although he did go back to making I think it was about 3 features post-communist, he has devoted his entire career to film education along the lines of Alexander McKendrick. And it's the same with Has. His last 3 decades, his main day job was as the dean of the Łódź Film School. Amazing,
and it's amazing to have that kind of filmmaker teaching filmmakers. I'd love to read that interview about.
There's a documentary about Has in which she's one of the talking heads. I'll send you a copy of it.
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, I'd love to see that, because I think that like that, and I think it's much more common outside of the UK and America in terms of having those kinds of filmmakers, because of like you say, the national systems of film production, education are more closely tied, but also, the system for making films is not as open as it is in the UK, which is not very open at all.
No, it's very. I watch quite a few student short films and also in retrospect, and it's very interesting looking at the end credits because they will list the artistic supervisors, and they're often very big names indeed. I think they're very much a tradition of sort of going back and contributing to the new generation.
Yeah, building film culture, as well as just sort of getting people jobs in campus departments.
And you get sort of initiatives like there's a program that to make where people get to make half an hour shorts between their sort of diploma film and their first professional job, and it's very. I mean, the thing about Poland is it does actually have a pretty vibrant film industry in terms of infrastructure. It's got the big advantage of having a big population, so there is a local audience there. You don't need to appeal to international audiences, and in a lot of cases they don't bother trying. I mean, for example, the film Clergy, which is a massive blockbuster in Poland. I mean, one of the biggest hits of the 21st century. It grossed over £1 million in its first weekend in the UK and Ireland, despite getting virtually no publicity in the English-speaking media, because they didn't need it. They knew that the Poles would know perfectly well what that film was, and they would come to see it, which they did. So, why waste money chasing an audience that would be far less interested?
Yeah, it's already there.
Yeah. So it's and similarly, I mean, Netflix is I can almost justify my subscription to Netflix as a legitimate business expense because there's so much Polish stuff on there. So because increasingly they're
yeah. And it is, that is one of the boons of this age is access.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem with Netflix is it's got very little before about 2010, and I don't think anything made in the 20th century. It's a real shame because it could be an amazing platform for. They did have a load of. I think they briefly did a deal with the Tor Film Unit. And then there was this sudden flurry of like 1970s Krzysztof Zanussi films, but they didn't last very long. So I imagine viewing things, obviously no publicity at all. I stumbled upon them completely by accident.
Yeah.
And so presumably the ratings just weren't good enough. And
it's a shame. Yeah, because these platforms could do, they're doing a lot in some ways, but
yes,
not to be kind to Netflix.
But there is something, I will always thank Netflix for. There's an amazing Polish film called The Hater by Jan Komasa, who's one of the most interesting of the younger generation of filmmakers, and it's one of the most intelligent and incisive dissections of the misuse of social media that I've ever seen. It was all set to open theatrically in March 2020, and you can guess what's coming next. That release got cancelled, and then Netflix bought it lock, stock and barrel and put it online where it still is, and then good for them.
And that's called The Hater.
The Hater, yeah, really, really good.
Cool.
It's about someone who just uses social media to destroy people's reputations, including political reputations. It's a psychopath, basically.
This is the retrospective's playing from the beginning of April.
In fact, literally April the 1st, which is or would have been Has's 100th birthday.
Oh, lovely.
We were very keen to actually hit that, and that it's mostly in sequence, but we're showing Saragossa manuscript on that day because you have to. It's such a disproportionately famous film. It's such a great one to see on the big screen with a pretty much guaranteed sellout audience. Sometimes you just have to give in to.
Yeah. We say that a lot. Sometimes things are just what they are for a reason, and you just have to kind of.
And we've got Tomasz Kalankiewicz, who's the head of the National Film Archive in Warsaw, coming over to introduce it. And I have yet to see this glorious thing. Hopefully, he'll show it to us. He actually has a Saragossa manuscript related tattoo.
Wow!
And I gather not a small one either. So yes, he is admirably qualified to introduce the film.
Yeah, literally. Wearing it on his body. This program has toured sort of other places. I think it was in the US last year.
There's the complete retrospective is being split between the BFI South Bank and the ICA.
Yeah.
Which is obviously very, very great. The overall umbrella is the Kinoteka Polish Film Festival. And we're very grateful indeed to both the BFI and the ICA for giving those screening slots, because that's what has enabled us to do a complete retrospective.
And
it also there's going to be poster exhibitions at both the BFI and the ICA of the Has, the original Has Polish posters, which are are quite extraordinary, as you
bet.
can probably imagine.
Yeah, I bet.
In fact, the poster for the Hourglass Sanatorium, that skull with a massive great single eyeball, is one of the most famous Polish posters of all time. And I gather the one that's going to be on display is absolutely enormous. I haven't seen it yet, but I'm greatly looking forward to it.
I'm going to check that out. I think I'm in London. Well, I'm in London at the beginning of April.
So we're kicking off with Saragossa manuscript, and then the BFI South Bank is showing the early ones in order, and then the baton is being passed to the ICA for How to Be Loved. I deliberately picked that title because I wanted them to start off with a really, really strong one.
Yeah.
And then the VFI is going to be doing things like the codes and the doll, and then the ICA is doing the last four films. So yes, they're all, and then I think they're both showing Saragossa manuscript and the Hourglass Sanatorium at some point.
Nice. Were you involved in the event, sort of the Lincoln Center last year in New York?
I wasn't.
No.
But
Do you know anything about like how that's gone down? Like how is Hass's sort of reputation growing? Like what, you know?
Well, it's certainly growing. I mean, it's very interesting reading Annette Insdorf's book on Hass, where she describes how difficult it was, because people will be saying, "Oh, you should write a book about Hass," and then she tried to find out how easy it was to see Hass's films, and it really wasn't at all. And this is my experience. I ended up importing a load of French DVDs with French subtitles because these films weren't out even in Poland. For some reason, I mean, this is not uncommon. France, it's a greater champion of certain Polish filmmakers than in their native country. This has finally been redressed in Poland. There is an extremely lavish Blu-ray box set, a complete box set, which is eye-wateringly expensive. I mean, I could justify it as a business expense, but I think it cost me something like 300 quid, including postage. And so it was. I pretty much need it. Make it a professional. It's an amazing thing. They're all it's the same high definition restorations that have been shown to you with complete English subtitles, English menus, completely bilingual, very hefty book. So as an introduction to Hass is great, but it's not a sort of casual purchase.
No.
And in Britain, I think the only two Hass films that have ever been on home video are the two obvious ones, Saragossa and Hourglass Sanatorium.
Well, yeah.
I'm not aware of any plans to change that.
Oh, okay.
Which is interesting, because when we did the Skolimowski retrospective a couple of years ago, there's quite a bit of activity there, because the BFI and Second Run both brought out more than one Skolimowski release.
Yeah. Well, hopefully this will be a successful season, and that will lead to some change.
Yes, well, it's certainly it's an eye-opening season in terms of the chances of people seeing something good that they may never have even heard of before.
Yeah,
and you really can't go wrong with even a completely random selection.
No,
but then a film like Farewells, which is pretty much totally unknown, that's the one about the sort of working class women and the aristocratic young women World War II and so on. And I mean that's an absolutely phenomenal film, and it's very, very obviously going to be a really phenomenal film right from the opening scene. You think about Hass, you're in very, very safe hands right from the start, even when he's at his most baroque and fantastical and emotionally hard to follow. You just go with the flow.
And it seems significant that the Quay brothers have got sort of screenings alongside. They sort of filmmakers that have spoken about Hass.
Yes, so they are big. I mean, they are at pains to stress that their version of the Hourglass Sanatorium is an adaptation of the same Bruno Schulz literary source that Hass went through. It is not a remake of Hass's film. But then again, Bruno Schulz is so slippery and elusive anyway, that you can get three people to adapt the same thing, and they all three will turn out completely different. I haven't seen the Quay film yet. I'm very much hoping to see it for the first time in IMAX. But I do understand it is very different from the Hass film, as I would expect and hope it to be.
As you'd expect, yeah.
Have you seen it?
No. I'm hoping I'll catch it when I'm up in London. The
Quays are big Hass fans. They did an installation at the Barbican did quite a small retrospective of about 5 titles around about 2010, and they did a little installation for that. And they've been championing. In fact, actually, I worked with them on the BFI release of their short films, and they gave me some DVD-Rs of hitherto completely unavailable Hass titles because they knew I was interested in set. So they were very much involved in stimulating my early interest.
Wonderful. That's a nice place to end. I think this is going to stimulate a lot of interest, hopefully, in Has's work. So yeah, thank you so much for putting the season together.
No, not at all. Not at all. It was, and all credit to the BFI and ICA and Kinoteka. This was, from my perspective, a very, very easy job indeed, because these films they all came from the same Polish source. They all had subtitles already. They all had DCPs already. Everything was sort of handed to me on a plate. So
great.
There's not a huge amount to congratulate me over the first set.
Well, let me congratulate you for coming on the podcast when you've been poorly.
Very much my pleasure. I barely coughed at all, actually.
Yeah. It'll be a very easy editing job. I appreciate that.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to the final version.
Thank you, Michael. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks to Michael for his time, particularly because he was recovering from not being well. And thanks to Alex Morris, the publicist who helped set up the conversation. As Dario said before, these are, if you're listening to this on or around April the 1st, this is the start of the Has season at Kinoteka. So if you are in London, and try and get down to see some of them, because they are extraordinary films. As someone who is seeing them digitally in Cornwall, I'm kind of envious of that opportunity to see them on the big screen, as you can imagine from the conversation that you've just heard. But Dara, I wanted to sort of spend this time talking about the films themselves that you've seen and that I've seen, because as we said before, it was a chance to really spend time with those films. So what have you seen, and how did you respond to them sort of on viewing them?
Yeah, so I've only seen 2 so far, and there must be 20, 25 on the
I think
file.
14 features, 14 features, and then also, or maybe it's fewer features, but loads of shorts as well.
Yeah. Because that's an interesting background as well. It mentions there the sort of beginning with the industrial documentaries and the shorts. And I think it's really fascinating to sort of think of somebody who's gone through almost a sort of an apprenticeship in visual precision and spatial awareness, because those are the 2 things that really struck me about the 2 films that I've seen, which is The Noose. So I wanted to watch that one first, and yeah, he recommended that. Michael did, obviously, and I would start with that if that was an option. You could say, I want to start with one film. I think I'm right in saying these are going up on the BFI player. Is that right?
Oh, I don't know, maybe.
I think they are, yeah, because I went and looked on there, and some of them said coming soon.
Right, amazing. Yeah.
So yeah, but they are coming, as you said, they're coming to the BFI South Bank and to the ICA, and yeah, I think that's really important as well, because that sort of sense of production design and mise en scène, and how that ties in to the visual composition, and the camera movements particularly, and the positioning of the cameras and where they're directed at, is just somebody who's absolute master of spatial awareness and placing the viewer in space. And you get that very much so in the sort of relationship between the guy's flat at the beginning of The Noose, and it's sort of moving around and making the space look kind of interesting and sort of portentous and a bit claustrophobic, but also, his movement in space is kind of a concert between the character and the space and the camera. They're always sort of working together in really interesting ways. And the first 15 minutes of the Hourglass Sanatorium is like a masterclass in that. I would show that to any sort of production designer / cinematography team and say, just look at this. This is these two departments working in, absolutely perfectly together to give a certain type of impression, right? And yeah, just what I have to say, I think that I'm going to be all in with this filmmaker for a while now, because it just reminded me of, we're talking off mic about this idea of the difference between cinema and content.
Yeah.
And it's almost kind of a radical experience to watch these films that are just truly cinematic. And you're reminded of that and the difference between the 99% of kind of, new work, let's say, that we see today. And I know I've got a kind of, at the moment, I'm going through a downer on even stuff that is reasonably fine, you know what I mean? All good. It still doesn't hit in the same way as this stuff does. And I think it's interesting because there was a quote from Haas that I read where he said he's very much not well, the sort of sociology and content and politics of what he's producing is secondary, let's say, to the notion of ideas through form. So he said this quote, he says, "I reject matters, ideas, themes, only significant to the present day. Art film dies in an atmosphere of fascination with the present." So clearly he's kind of interested in sort of timeless concepts.
Yeah.
And that sort of sense of the feeling he's giving the audience in being in situ, you know what I mean, in the film world that he's producing. And in many ways, I think I see, again, you know, you mentioned it earlier on, the correlation to Ackerman and that sort of sense that here is a filmmaker who's totally in tune with their sensibility, which is very, you know, the two are quite different in various ways. But I think that there is definitely, you know, a sort of sense of a craft being developed over time that's being harnessed and honed. And then, you know, you were sort of talking about his relationship to teaching as well, you know, and it's so interesting to watch this stuff now in the context of today's filmmaking culture, which is so throwaway. And, you know, talking about like say, for example, one thing struck me about the conversation we had about Gladiator 2 and Ridley Scott being kind of criticized for being lazy and just shooting everything and then sorting out in the edit. There couldn't be any more difference between that and the precision of the camera placement and the camera movement that you see in Hass's films. And it's kind of mesmerizing to watch, I thought.
Yeah. Oh, God, there's loads there, wasn't there? That was great. Where to begin? Yeah, and it's interesting, I think, as well, what's important about it, you know, we sort of talked about in interviews like this, The Noose is his feature debut, and it is fully formed, and it's fully formed because of the apprenticeship that you're talking about, you know, like, which is why I think showing the short films is really, really important, because, you know, significant work, and it's significant also in terms of seeing how someone gets to a point where they make a first feature and can just deliver it on that kind of level. And, you know, there is a kind of production context there, which I think is important, which is, you know, shooting sort of state in documentary is you have to do it quick. And, you know, like you don't get many chances, like it's in situ work. But if you've got the desire to do something visually interesting, even in that space, if you're a filmmaker everywhere you are, you know, so honing that ability to quickly make decisions that make it, you know, the most aesthetically interesting it can be, and then carrying that over as a kind of discipline, I think is really, really important, which means that you can go into something and the time is spent where it needs to be spent. And that's, and then The Noose is so lean in terms of, it just, it feels, lean's probably the wrong, you know, like kind of like it's just distilled into its essence, you know. And then reading about him, you know, it's what you're saying there about his themes and ideas, you know, it's kind of like they are political in the sense that he is coming from the political context, particularly under Stalinism, of rejecting content, you know. You know, there's a great quote where it's like, you know, Stalinist films it's all about the content, it's about the messaging, and he's like, no, it's all about the form, you know. And the way he talks about cinema as a kind of time loop, as his, you know, very much as his kind of dream space, is really, really fascinating. And it's like, it's hard when people say like, what is cinematic about X, you know, it's like, it's hard often to describe, because it's a kind of feeling. But then you show them some of these, you know, like the opening sequence of the Hourglass Sanatorium, it's like, well, this is it.
That's cinema. Look at it there.
That's cinema. Like, you know, like it's, you know, and it's that's not a lazy thing. That's a kind of, that's something which is kind of intuitive, I think, in the part of filmmakers. When it's done really, really well, when there's an interest in the form. And the other thing is that, you know, we sort of mentioned the kind of the Kubrick sort of connection, as in like really interested in adaptation, but it's not like taking a literary source and doing a literal translation. It's taking this kind of core text and then translating it into cinema. But what I loved about sort of reading some of his interviews around adaptation is that he sees the book as a kind of as a specific form, the novel
Yeah.
and the kind of its ability to play around with time, and the way it can sort of change perspective and point of view. He's very, very adept at kind of having that as a cinematic counterpart to that, which
Yeah.
not everyone can. Like when you see adaptations, oftentimes it's just, here's the story, here's the content,
Yeah.
here's it played out, and it's like, no, he wants to do something where it's honoring this form. And I know you haven't seen Saragossa yet, but there's so much in Saragossa which relates to things like Tristram Shandy,
Right.
particularly in terms of this kind of stories within stories within stories, and how and there's a lot of like Don Quixote in there as well.
Mm.
But yeah, he's a really, really cinematic presence,
Yeah.
which is
But
just
he uses
it's exciting.
Yeah, and he uses editing as well in a kind of adaptive way. I think that, but it doesn't become, it's not beholden to the adaptation process like the fidelity of story.
Yeah.
Because if you read about his use of adaptation, it's very much about a dialogue with what the book represented at its time, and not a kind of faithful. And that's why he was both politically and aesthetically kind of troubling to the authorities, because he was messing around with the canonicity of those texts. And I think, I've been doing, again, I'm sort of seeing through everything through the lens of editing at the moment, because I'm doing so much teaching on that. But we've been working on kind of these ideas of radical continuity and montage within the frame. And these two things, I think, are absolutely there in his work. So this idea of sort of radical continuity, and there's one moment in the Noose where it's that early on where he's having a conversation with a guy in the street who's asking him about being a drunk, right? And then they see a bus, or is it a tram, that crashes, and somebody had just gotten on it, and then he's just having this sort of one-to-one dialogue, and then he turns, and then there's a shoe shine boy that he starts talking to, who's just finishing shining his shoes, but we never saw the start of that. Do you know what I mean? And it's just like one of those moments where the continuity is in the experience of the character, but not in the romantic spatial realism of the space in that sense. So it's playing with linearity, it's playing with our intuitive sense of continuity, and with the way we understand it in sort of mainstream filmmaking. And then you add that in when you get to the Hourglass Sanatorium, you can see that's developed even further, because this sort of montage within the frame, which is another way of saying a kind of long take where you've got a lot of shit going on, and then as an audience member you have you're looking at foreground and background, you're looking at the symbolic things that are going on all over the frame, and it gives you that sort of sense of a freedom, rather than in more conventional filmmaking, which uses a lot of shallow framing, so it's directing where you're supposed to be looking, right? So then you get this radical continuity where he's moving from space to space in the sanatorium. So the only thing and that's about sort of time shifts, isn't it? So it's kind of going back in time, but the continuity is still there, because here's one guy going from one room to another that's still in the house, but the rooms are all in different time periods, but perhaps in his psychology. So it's just working on such a expressively complicated but inventive level, and reading some, maybe again that's why his work doesn't play so widely, because it requires you again to kind of sit and be in tune with a certain kind of mode of viewing, I would say.
And how it sort of relies on performance as well to kind of to have those to be the guide, we talked about female characters, but I think the protagonists in the films, and there's a great film called How to Be Loved, which is just absolutely fabulous, but it relies on these performances to guide the audience through, to carry all these ideas which are happening, and these kind of really significant jumps in How to Be Loved. It's set on an airplane, this woman sort of taking a flight, and she's recalling internally and a little bit externally while she's talking to the person she's sitting next to about her life, and then it kind of
Right.
cuts back during the war, and this kind of this thing she does during the war, and then it's how that impacts her life after the war, and you never really know what is happening in terms of why she's going to Paris, and you're never told. Like, you know, there's a lot, but and there's huge jumps in terms of like the bits of the story that you get. Like, it's not a full faithful, you know, retelling as if anything could be. It's very much about her memory of stuff, and the stuff that's important to her is what we see.
Yeah.
But again, like the actress who also pops up in Saragossa manuscript is just so good at holding all of the different times and all of the different emotional complexities, you know, in the same way that, you know, sort of the main character in Hourglass, who kind of is this guide, literal guide through all these times and spaces. Like, you just you're rooted in it always because of them. And I think it's, you know, it's never an academic exercise, none of any of this stuff, which I think is what it often feels like contemporarily. Is like, look at what we're doing and look at what we're saying through this. And it's not. There's a real intuitiveness to it in terms of wanting it to be experiential, and casting and production design and the camera and the editing is all working in sync. And it was funny because, to go back to the Soderbergh, one of the things I went with a colleague, and afterwards I said, it's so nice to be in the company of someone who knows what they're doing in terms of film.
Yeah.
You know, like, and it's so rare. You realize it's like actually using this language is, you know, we talked about the Ackerman thing that you know, and we were referring to Celine Sciamma sort of saying how lazy cinema is as a young medium, and how you want to kind of take it by the lapels. And, you know, Soderbergh moves you through space with characters just kind of effortlessly, where you're kind of aware of everything that you need to be aware of, or that he wants you to be aware of, but not in this kind of look at me way. It just feels like this is storytelling. And I don't mean that in terms of content. I mean in terms of guiding a viewer with a character through a narrative. And it's kind of like, oh, it's so rare to find that. So then thinking about that Hourglass opening, where you have no idea where you are or when you are, and then these characters bring in these concepts of what you're seeing, and you're like, how's this gonna
it's an amazing entry into a film, isn't it? Because it's kind of got a bit of the Jonathan Harker going to the Dracula's castle feel about it at the beginning, but then it kind of slips into sort of talking about what filmmakers is Has in dialogue with, but it's kind of like Tarkovsky meets Buñuel. You know what I mean?
Nicely done. Yeah.
And it's like that sort of sense of everybody's acting in a way that is not offering you, again, that realist clue. You know, there's something going on here that is extraneous to a sort of sense of psychological realism or momentum in terms of the plot.
Yeah.
And you know, it's not explained. It's just not explained. And then then you have to sort of realize it's an experiential thing, which is why I'm looking forward to seeing it at the cinema as much as anything else.
Yeah.
You know, and you think it's something, you think of something like Stalker. It's got that sense of, we're moving through spaces, you know what I mean? And each space has a particular kind of impact on you, and on a sort of, you know, emotional or, you know, physical level, really. You know, especially I'm thinking if you see it in the auditorium. But then like the noose, you know, and we sort of agreed on this off mic, that the first thing that hit me was The Trial, you know, Wells's film, and that sense of a kind of Kafkaesque level of surveillance. But it's much less about sort of overarching organizations, but more a kind of the idea of a culture of knowing, you know what I mean, and judgment. Because this guy's obviously an alcoholic. That's the whole point, is, can he get through to the end of the day when his wife has booked him a spot in a drying out clinic. So it's kind of interesting. It's got a very sort of familiar kind of tale to it. You know, if you think about all of the narratives in film, TV, or just in popular culture about, you know, people trying to addiction and people trying to beat it in that sense. But like, you know, as the day progresses, you can see that all of his entanglements with different people are raising his sort of his level of anxiety and sort of his grip on reality, which obviously he's trying to take himself out of with the drink. And I guess that's where the political element comes in, that this was very problematic. That idea that it's an anti-hero who's trying to deal with this sort of societal. I mean, again, it's not even something that has a structure to it in the film, but there's knowing allusions, I think, to what it feels like to be sort of in Poland in the in the late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's probably why they didn't want it to be widely seen in terms of. But a lot of that is, I think, as well because of the characters. Kind of, he resolutely wants to not get better. It is that kind of real. That's where it feels very, very existential, particularly in that kind of early 60s European context of like he and very articulate and very kind of almost charismatic a lot of the times in terms of owning the position of the alcoholic as a kind of identity, but also as a kind of almost like you say anti-hero, kind of anti-establishment identity. Like I'm stepping outside of all of this stuff and I don't engage and I don't want to engage. And there's a kind of tragic outcome to that, which is obviously in the title, but also just in terms of like seeing a character acknowledge that he doesn't want the help, and there's loads of great conversations with other alcoholics and people about the systems that are in place to help. But what happens when the person doesn't, that it's the thing of like, you can be helped but you have to help yourself. And he doesn't want to help himself. And that produces this massively intense, and the way that it's captured in terms of, the way that he is sort of filmed in these spaces and how the editing kind of creates these, again, it's a dialogue between characters, which is often not at the level of spoken dialogue. It's in terms of the editing between people in the bar, the people who work in the bar, other alcoholics, figures of authority, and how you kind of get this real tension of how far outside of society he actually is and is willing to put himself. And it's so cleverly done.
And it's the tracking shots as well, isn't it? It's the tracking shots that have a depth, and a lot of them start. So you'll have certain points. It'll start where the camera is angled up, and then a character will move from one side to the other, but they will go down a stairs or they'll go up some stairs to a different level, and then suddenly you're on a level with the character, and the blocking is all done, so you're going in and out of the frame as well, and it's kind of like you see this done really badly in soap operas, when in the sort of 60s and 70s when cameras weren't mobile at all, like a character would have to come into focus at a certain point, and it just looks like, oh, you've walked over there literally to deliver your line, but it never looks like that. It's sort of a mastery of like a symphony of movement, where that sort of the film kind of constructs within the aesthetics itself almost a sort of emotional architecture. You know what I mean? And it's just amazing to I was just sort of like gobsmacked at that first sort of 20 minutes. It's just amazing. And then again, that sort of moving from different character to different character, and they're all, there's there's sort of a bit of the Fellini type characterization going on there, where everybody's kind of some kind of cipher for something,
And I think that, what I was trying to allude to in terms of the dialogue bit of the conversation with Michael and sort of earlier on, it's I'm not interested in who saw these films and when and how they responded. I'm just more interested in that, you talk about Wells and The Trial and Fellini, and there are kind of similar artistic approaches to certain existential themes and ways of doing things, which it feels like a lot of these films and filmmakers are in dialogue with each other, not willfully ripping each other off, but just there's these kinds of, which I think is the same for any kind of poetry, or kind of theatre movement or literature movement, where all across the globe at similar times there are similar artistic responses, which I just think I'm interested in how Haas, whose work didn't travel very well to festivals and he didn't travel with it, and wasn't widely seen, but how how, like you talk about Tarkovsky and Boomwell, and how there are these kinds of similarities in tone and feel and
Yeah.
sort of artistic sort of choices, which are really interesting in terms of like what's going on in the wider context of Europe in that period.
Yeah.
And he seems very interested, like you say, in using the past as a way of figuring out how things feel at a given moment, not what they say or what the reality of a lived, but how does it feel,
Yeah.
and he's able to do that in kind of so many different time periods across his work, which is, and like I like about Hourglass is you're never sure what time it is at any period. Is it the past? Is it the future? Where are we? Yeah, it reminded me of Terry Gilliam's best work. It reminded me of like Brazil in 12 months.
Yeah. Yeah, there is something of that in it as well. Yeah, for sure. But again, I don't think it's beyond the pale to compare filmmakers in this. I mean, it's not even a comparison, isn't it? It's kind of like echoes. I guess. Yeah, I guess the problem is if there is a sort of reduction to, oh, this is like, I don't know. When you say something is sub Tarantino, it's almost kind of like a put down, isn't it?
Yeah.
But
yeah, I just think it's like we're trying to get people to see the work.
Yeah,
and
that's
then
it.
and have that conversation. And the Tarkovsky thing was not something I picked up on, but as soon as you say it, I'm like, oh yeah, and it kind of articulates the feelings that we have when we watch it with our kind of cinephilia, sort of antenna up, I suppose, which I mean, we like that. And I don't think it's about saying, what was great about that conversation was at no point did I ever think like, oh, there's a reason why he wasn't as famous as Varda, or, it's like, this is, it doesn't matter because the context is so different.
But you can't get away from the context is different, but you can't get away from the fact that there is a connecting context, which is post-war modernism.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And a reaction to the state of experience in relationship from one country to another, but how those things can kind of, Eastern Europe as a block. And, sort of Michael talked about that at the beginning, that he was into kind of Eastern European kind of art and culture and music as much as sort of specifically Polish. And obviously there is a uniqueness or a specificity to Poland, but then, that the Eastern European kind of idea of what the effect of the Second World War and the post-Second World War Soviet Union bloc will be very different to, the UK and Western Europe. And you can definitely sort of make comparisons, like say within the UK, but acknowledging still that Scotland and Wales and England and Ireland all have different, unique experiences within a kind of collective sort of sensibility in certain ways. And I think, it's really interesting to kind of consider Poland in relationship to the sort of the realism of Romania that we've looked at in the past, which is a very different type of realism, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
then now they have Radu Juda, kind of doing, which feels weirdly closer to Haas.
It does.
So yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's like the sort of Radu Juda moving through times. His is placed in very much a kind of postmodernist, digital technology encroaching on the present experience type of way, whereas probably there's a very similar kind of sensibility in the context of how you're working, the environment that you're working in, that Has experienced in the 50s and 60s. It's kind of like by osmosis, the culture, the politics, it just influences and shapes the way that you make film, no matter how psychological or metaphysical you want it to be. You can't help it but it be, situated within a sense of that idea of kind of Polish alienation from the state, or however you want to characterize it.
Yeah, no, for sure. And what I like about Haas's interviews and his films is like he just leaves that for everyone else. He doesn't. That's for us to mine, but also he doesn't do that really annoying thing of saying, oh, that's not there. He's just like, I'm just not interested in it. It's just not like it's shutting down his interest, but not saying that all of these things. He's very aware of the context he was working within because he chose to stay working with it. and that body of work is a kind of testament to those choices that we can now enjoy thanks to all of this great work.
Yeah. I think, and even there's obvious kind of allusions really, which he might deny, but like with the Hourglass Sanatorium, that the fact that there is a story about a sort of a Jewish anti-hero that is searching for a kind of sense of his father and mother and himself really as the film goes on. The fact that was sort of shot during the anti-Semitic purges in the 60s, that has to be a connection that is being made.
It does, yeah. And I think there's a lot of stuff written about that, his kind of positionality as a non-Jew and how that was also received at the time. In terms of like, why are you making this work? Like it's, and again, we talk a lot about that in terms of who gets to
tell the story,
to tell whose stories, and here's another filmmaker working in a very complicated context, and doing really interesting work where, those resonances can't help but be felt.
Yeah. Excuse me. I knew that was coming next. Great. Well, all I can say is get down to the BFI or to the ICA and check out some of these movies, because who knows when you'll be able to see them on the big screen again. And
for sure,
they are, as much as we're talking about being in dialogue, they are singular experiences. There is
really, for sure, nothing like this
really around, and it is a chance to engage with a filmmaker that many cinephiles won't.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's a great boon to have this season available, and if some of those films make it onto the BFI player, then all the better. But yeah, massive thank you to Alex Morris for setting up the chat, and to Michael Brooke for his time to sort of prime us for what has been a fantastic voyage of discovery so far with the work of Wojciech Has.
Just to say also, because Neil is coming down or coming up to London, depending on how geographically you want to talk about that. Across. Yeah, maybe. But we'll be in the same room. So we're taping this crime episode that we mentioned, but we're also going to be doing a bonus on the Saragossa manuscript and this newer film, which is on Netflix, called The Hater. So if you want to check that out, then we'll be talking about that next week, which apparently is very good, but nobody's seen it because it's been buried on Netflix. So there will be a bonus episode on this to come, and that will be available obviously for the Patreons. And just to say, we've had another Patreon subscriber sign up for our £3.50 coffee membership, and they are Fatos Akoyun. So thank you very much, Fatos, for joining up. We had a little bit of a discussion of his filmmaking likes on the Patreon chat, so that was good fun. We still have some Chantel Ackerman magazines, the Sight and Sound Special Edition. So if anybody upgrades to the £6 membership or joins at £6, then we'll send one of those your way, along with a postcard, an IRL postcard as well. It's all about the getting in touch with physical media again.
Absolutely, yeah. Film prints, DVDs, VHS, postcards, cassettes, you name it. We're going to be doling them all out over the next couple of years for sure. Yeah, and thanks to you, Dario, as always, for a really thoughtful conversation in response to the interview and the films.
No, I loved it, and I wish I'd have been able to get to more of the kind of broader Kinoteka Film Festival, because it is a really good program. I'd go on Google and look at that, and there's the film posters exhibition, which you and I can catch up with when you come down, because that looks amazing too.
You read my mind. I thought maybe we'd head down there as part of our kind of coverage for the podcast. Yeah, because I love film posters. So yeah, let's do that. But we'll be back with another episode very shortly. I'm actually on my way to Newlyn this evening as we take this to tape The Doors, the Oliver Stone film, which is the choice of Mark Jenkin. I'm looking forward to seeing that. I haven't seen that in a very long time. And then, yes, that might be the next one. We've got loads more stuff lined up for the next couple of months. But for now, thanks to everyone for your continued support. This has been the Cinematologist Podcast. Thanks for listening.